My name is Rick. I'm a cloud solution architect focusing on app innovation. Today I will be explaining how to create a Graph API subscription using a low-code approach. We can either use Power Automate or Logic App for this. In this first module, we need to understand what the requirements are for setting up and handling notifications. First, we need to have an understanding of how to handle the validation token before we do anything. Let's jump right into these requirements now. In order to create Graph subscriptions, we need to create a webhook. Many will use an app service or an Azure function for this. During the subscription process, a validation token will be sent to the webhook. It will require a response that has to fulfill three requirements. The first requirement is a HTTP 200 status code. Second is it needs to be a content type of text/plain. And third, a body that contains the validation token provided by the initial Graph request. If any of these are not met, the subscription will not be created. So before we submit the request to Graph to subscribe for notifications, we need to implement our webhook first and ensure that we have proper logic in place. So once the webhook is ready, we'll use Graph Explorer to create the subscription. Let's get started creating a flow that can meet the three requirements for processing the validation token. Okay, so let's get right into learning how to process the validation token for Graph API subscriptions. So the first thing I want to call out here is on my screen here, you'll see several Graph operations that come in handy when you're working with Graph API and subscriptions. The first one is just a simple GET request. This will list all subscriptions. So you see here I have this over here in the Graph window on the left, and I'll execute that in a minute. The next one that is very useful as well is when you're experimenting with these subscriptions, oftentimes you'll need to be able to delete it so you can recreate it. So that's what this request does here. It's the syntax for it. You can find all the stuff online. And the most important one here is to create your subscription as a post request. You need to create a body that contains these details here. You'll need a notification URL and the resource that you're subscribing to notifications for. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to subscribe to an inbox folder for new messages, and we'll receive a notification when a new message is sent to that inbox. So in order to get started here, first thing I want to do is I want to jump over to Graph Explorer, and I'm just going to do a real quick GET request, and we'll see here that return no subscriptions. If there were subscriptions, they would be enumerated in this array here. So with that being said, let's jump over to my GitHub Pages Azure 411 site, and let's take a look at the details for processing validation tokens for subscriptions. And essentially there are four requirements here. You must respond with a HTTP 200 status code, and the content type must be of text plain. And you must also return the body containing the validation token that was provided during the initial Graph request. Also, this must all be done within 10 seconds of the initial subscription request to Graph API. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to demonstrate how to create a subscription using a webhook that we're going to create in Power Automate. Most people will use an Azure function for this or an app service, but if you can use a low-code approach, why not? It's simple and straightforward. It may require you to go through some exercises that I'm going to demonstrate today to better understand how to do this. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to open this Get Started flow here, and we can tell from our requirements on the left here that we need to process a HTTP request, and next we need to send a response back. So you can see here that I'm not meeting these requirements. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull the URL for this HTTP request, I'm going to navigate back over to graph. I'm going to change this to a post, and I'm going to populate the notification URL with this flow that I have on the right hand side here. And what will happen is you're going to see it's going to error out because we're not processing the validation token, but I want you to see what the response looks like. So I'll run the query. You can see here we got a bad request. It says subscription validation request failed. Response must exactly match validation token query parameter. So we didn't reply back. That is exactly why we got that error message. So I'm going to show you how to go about figuring out what the header looks like, how to extract the content header, and how to reply back. So I have another flow created for that in an effort to save us some time. And what I'm going to do now is open this flow here. And I'm going to walk you through this process. It's fairly straightforward. So we got our HTTP receive request. And when we get that, we're going to use the parse JSON header or parse JSON action to actually parse the header from the initial request that's sent over to our webhook here. And this schema can be extracted based on the inbound data that's sent in, and I'll show you how to get to that. All you got to do is essentially make this request, and you can set this flow up with minimal data. You need a HTTP request and a variable or something to validate that it's a valid flow to start with. Run it, then you can take a look at the history, and we can click on HTTP request and click on show raw output, and this will give us the data that was passed into us, and you can generate a schema using this data. That's essentially what I did here. So I simply copied this, and then I edit the flow, and I came down here and selected generate from sample, and that's what yielded our schema here. So the next thing I need to do is, based on our requirements, is I need to verify that what's being sent to me is in fact of content type text plain, because that's what the specifications state. So what I'll do now is I will extract the content type from this header information using the content type field. And you can see here that I'm using this expression here. I'm pulling the body content type from the parse JSON headers action, and I'll store the content type in this variable. And now that we know the content type, we can process that or take action based on the content type. So if we look at the specification for receive change notifications, what we'll note is that the validation token, you must respond with a 200 with content plain text, and you must echo the validation token body back in a body response. Now, in order to process change notifications, the requirement for it is to respond back with a status code of 200, and then you can process the change request. So note that in my switch statement here, I'm only going to process the plain text for example purposes here, and I'm going to walk you through that. I will tell you that I purposely have a failure set up here so I can walk you through the troubleshooting process. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate back, and I am going to extract the URL for this flow. I'm going to replace it with the previous one that I was using, which was that one that had minimal actions. And I'm going to run this query now. And we can see that the subscription validation failed. Notification endpoint must respond with a 200 OK. So if I come and look at the run history, and what we'll see is on the switch statement here is we see that it executed the default side of the branch. So it did not drop into my case plain text switch statement. So let's take a look at this. So the validation, the var content type, we can see that it's set to text/plain text : space char set. Take a note at my switch statement. There is no space between the semicolon here and the char set. So I'm going to modify that, and I am just going to add a space there. And you can see here on the left, if you look closely at the error message, it in fact is giving you the truth here. So I'll save this guy, and I will go ahead and run the subscription request again. And this time we should see we definitely have a valid subscription here. This is the ID for the subscription that was just created. And if we come back and look at the run history here, we will see in fact that it made it through all this logic, and that we checked our switch statement, and we can see here that we're composing the validation token here so we can reply back. I'll walk you through that in a second here, but we can see in fact that this is being pulled from the header info. If I come over here and look at raw text of the inbound request, I can see that this is the validation token text, and notice how it has the request ID here. If I close that and take a look at this compose statement here, we can see it in fact matches. So we've got to, in order to meet our requirements, we've got to respond with a 200. The content type has to be text plain, and we have to echo the body back. So that meets the requirements of this API. So you can see here we're responding back, we're acknowledging with a 200, we're setting the content type to text plain, and we're setting the body to the validation token that was passed into us. This satisfies this part of the specification and the set of requirements. So now any new inbound emails that come into the inbox that we subscribe to, we will get notification on that now. So in the next module, we'll talk about processing notifications. But what I want to do now is I want to edit this flow. And I just want to walk you through some specifics because I've been going kind of fast here. So first thing that you want to do is you want to, run your first flow with minimal variables and minimal actions, so you can take a look at what the request headers look like, and then you can pull that plain text, use that to generate a schema using parse JSON. Then next you want to assign the content type to a variable, so we can branch on it. We can switch based on the content type. Because keep in mind, now that I have successfully processed the validation token, technically I can remove the switch statement. This logic would no longer be required, because subsequent requests to this flow will only be notifications that are sent in, unless for some reason I delete the subscription and recreate it. So I typically leave this logic in the flow or in my logic app. So this allows us to continue processing here. So just keep in mind, all we had here was a switch statement based on the content type, and if the content type is text plain, char equal UTF-8, keep in mind there's a space here. Next thing we do is we use a compose action to compose the validation token using the output of the query. We're using the triggers output to pull down the validation token from the inbound request that's coming in here, and that will assign the validation token to this compose statement. Then we can leverage that validation token and echo it back in the body of this response here, and see how we have the status code set to 200 and content type set to plain text. Now that wraps it up for this module. I would encourage you to navigate out to my Azure 401 GitHub Pages site and take a look at the how-to guides, and you can leverage the lab here if you want to walk through this more manually. In this lab, I'm using a logic app instead of a Power Automate flow. Essentially, they're one and the same thing. A little more power if you want to use logic apps. So take a look and navigate out to the Azure 411 site. So in the next module, what I'll be doing is I'll be covering how to handle the notifications that are sent to us when and email arrives in that inbox folder. So stay tuned, and I hope this was helpful.